What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Sea of Stars, a JRPG inspired by the classics, while at the same time aiming to modernize some of it in a manner that is very similar to, it must be said, the recent Chained Echoes. And while this one actually released several months ago, I had been meaning to get around to it, as its very positive reception made me curious about what all it had to offer. That said, right here at the beginning, I do review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that, though in the case of this game, the achievement list is very thorough. And last but not least, while I did not actually get a review copy for this one, I did pay for this. When the game initially released, they had offered me one, but as the game released in the middle of the busiest season I've had all year, I knew it was going to take a couple months to get to it, so I declined it. From there, let's actually dive into this thing. So, as I mentioned, Sea of Stars is a turn-based RPG inspired by a lot of the great JRPGs of yesteryear, while at the same time trying to modernize some of those systems. So we see things like an approach to difficulty based off of relic items that you can turn on and off, a timing feature in combat, a slew of other convenience or quality of life improvements you could say over previous games. And I would say in its efforts to modernize that, it mostly succeeded. There's a few places that I think are a little weaker than others, but by and large, it's a great game. Its reception was very positive to say the least. But of course, over this review, I want to dig a little deeper than that and pick apart the things I enjoyed, what I didn't, etc. Now, as always, I like to start my reviews off with a note on the technical state, and while this is more relevant for newly released games, the main reason I'm adding it to this review is to say one thing, and that is that this game ran flawlessly, and while it's certainly not a technically demanding game or anything, it was simply nice to play a game that just kind of worked, where I didn't run into really any issues at all. But again, of course, some of that is due to just the nature of the title and its relatively simple systems, as I think my 4090 was probably a little bit overkill for the pixel art of this game, seeing as their recommended specs mention a NVIDIA GTS 450, which is a graphics card from more than 10 years ago. So in terms of running this, I'd say just about anything you have will be able to. Moving on from there though, I wanted to talk a little bit about the difficulty of this game. Now overall, I wouldn't consider this a difficult game in any respect. It's a turn-based system, and we'll talk more about the combat in depth, but it's not exactly complicated to wrap your head around. To take that a little bit farther, there are various things you can adjust about the game to both increase quality of life things, make them easier, etc., and also adjust the difficulty of the game. This is done by finding relics. Through normal gameplay, you can find or buy these at various shops, at which point you can go into the relics menu and turn them on or off, and these range from things like doubling your health and reducing the damage you take from enemies, to more specific things like making sure your travel time on the world map is faster. There's also relics that increase the difficulty as well, so how difficult you find this game is largely going to be customizable. If you're having trouble, you can lower it by turning some of those on. If it's too easy, you can increase it by, of course, keeping them off or turning on some of the other relics you'll find later. And while this is a pretty cool feature that I like, I will say that I do wish they had a relic that just turned on healing after each combat, because as it stands, the relic that heals you after combat also doubles your health, which I didn't want, as doubling your character's health largely trivializes most of the game, but at the same time, in between combat sessions, you can just run back and rest pretty much whenever. There's no real limitation on that, so I was hoping there would be a relic that would just let you auto-heal after combat, but again, the one that does that also doubles your health. So I do wish they had separated those. Other than that though, a cool approach to things, I always enjoy customizable difficulty settings outside of just base difficulty options. Anything that allows you to go in and tweak specific aspects of the game more individually is always cool to see. But moving right along, now we're going to talk a little bit about the story. This game is still relatively new, so I don't really want to spoil it, but in many ways I would say it's representative of the genre it is inspired by. Humble beginnings to grand, very predictable ending, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but to be a little more specific, we have two main characters, Zale and Valerie, the two of which happen to be children of the solstice, special individuals born on respective solstices that grants them access to either lunar or solar magic, which is pretty much the only thing capable of defeating the giant dwellers, magic mostly impervious creatures created by a god known as the Fleshmancer. and these things are terrifying monstrosities. Overall, you would simply like to put a stop to these dwellers, as is your role as a child of the solstice. Now obviously it does get a little more complicated than that. There are twists and turns, plot reveals, etc., but a few things stood out to me. One, the game does like to poke fun at itself every once in a while, deliberately pointing out cliches and things. In fact, for instance, a character we meet early on is literally named Captain Cliché, so the game's not afraid to sprinkle in some humor here and there, and for the most part, I'd say the story is pretty good. Really, the only place that it actually falls flat for me is, disappointingly, the main characters themselves. While many of the companions you get and the characters you meet will have their own growth and development that happens, the two main characters here really fell flat. Outside of a sort of training montage at the beginning of the game, they don't really go through any growth or development. They kind of just stay themselves the entire game. Who they are is these special people born to save the world against this evil threat, and there is simply nothing else to them. They are the most boring characters in this game, as almost everyone else is more interesting than them, which I would say is the only place where the story really felt like it dropped the ball to me. Now, from there, let's talk a little bit about progression systems. There's a couple of them in this game, some directly related to combat and a few others that aren't, though in terms of character progression, this largely comes down to level ups and gear. As you participate in combat, of course, you're going to be earning experience, and when your characters level up, they will earn a bunch of increases to their stats, and what's more, for each individual character, you can pick a specific boost to an individual attribute. These are relatively minor, and they won't overcome what that character is naturally good at, so usually you want to lean into it. That said, for me, I found the most useful bonus to typically be extra magic points, as getting to use more of their abilities in combat without having to restore their points was just very useful. But each level is pretty impactful, and the max level is 30, though just as important as leveling up is equipping your characters with gear. Some of this is specific to individual characters, and other things can be used interchangeably. Each character does have a specific weapon type that only they can use, and because of this, gear progression for each individual character tends to be pretty straightforward. Typically, you can choose between either finding your weapons by exploring and moving around, or buying them from shops using your gold. But because of the limited nature of this progression, spending money on weapons a lot of the time isn't really worth it, because if you explore around and look for treasures, you can just find them. And while some of the early pieces of gear do have a little bit of variance in the exact stats they're boosting, once you get towards the later game, there's a lot of very clear linear progression here, where this item is simply better than the previous one, though naturally, to get the best stuff for each character in terms of armor and weapons, you gotta do the end-game side content. When it comes to gear though, each character does have a spot for like a special piece of gear that is kind of like an accessory, which can do more varied things, like for instance revealing non-boss enemies' resistances and weaknesses so you can maximize your damage effectively, which is also a pretty big part of it. Now there's several bits of non-combat progression that relate to building your own base, cooking, fishing, as well as some upgrades to your method of travel, but we'll save those for the gameplay section, and from here we will move right along to combat. Combat in Sea of Stars is a simple turn-based system that is, for the most part, easy enough to wrap your head around. Both you and the enemy are of course going to be taking turns, and when it's your character's turn, you can move any character that you have access to. Later on, when you have a larger party, a maximum of 6, you'll be able to swap them out freely on your turn and use the character's turn that you want to use, but the max number of characters you can have on screen is 3. They just don't really prevent you from swapping them in and out in any way. Now, every time you take an action, a counter will count down that you can see next to the enemies. This is the number of turns until their turn, and when that reaches 0, they will of course make their attacks. The rest of this comes down to locks, skills, and combos. Enemies, when they are casting an ability, will take a couple of turns to actually make that happen. And while they are counting down to the cast of that ability, you'll see a bunch of floating damage icons above their head indicating specific types of damage you should hit them with. For each type of damage you hit them with before they make that cast, it reduces the power of the incoming ability, and if you manage to break all of them, they lose their turn altogether. And while each of your character's base attack has a specific damage type associated to it, usually something like blunt or slashing, but also elemental things like poison or chaos, they also get access to skills and combo abilities that can do extra things or multiple hits that allow you to break these locks more easily. And many of those skills can also be used in tandem with other characters you have access to, provided you have combo points. As you participate in combat, break locks, etc., you'll build up to 3 combo points, and then you can use combo abilities, which usually combine the skills of 2 characters into an even stronger ability. And using all of those things is how you're going to approach breaking the locks on enemies, trying to interrupt what they're doing, and generally just doing as much damage as possible while trying to stay alive. And while bosses and things will usually have more interesting mechanics you need to play around or hit specific things, the bulk of the combat system that I've just explained to you is all there is, and it gets revealed to you in the first couple hours of gameplay, and it doesn't really go anywhere else from there. The only other thing of note really is that sometimes you have to time your abilities. When you are making an attack, if you time it properly, you'll make an extra attack. When you are being attacked, if you time a defensive block correctly, you can take reduced damage from it. So there is a bit of a timing system involved, but that's about as interesting as it gets, which means over the course of a roughly 25 to 30 hour adventure, the combat can get a little stale, and they do not shy away from giving it to you. While there are no random encounters per se, you'll run into the enemies that you see, which initiates combat. There are a lot of enemies, many of which are not avoidable, which means you're going to be doing a lot of this combat that frankly gets a little old after the first few hours. So overall, I would say combat is okay, but it's probably not going to wow you, and I do wish there was just a little more variety to things, as towards the end I definitely found myself just trying to avoid it wherever possible, as it was mostly just an inconvenience. So that brings us to the world and gameplay section. Now the world is largely made up of individual islands. Initially, you'll be locked to an individual island at a time that you have to find means of traversing between. This means you're going to be occasionally in individual locations like towns or specific explorable areas, and in between those specific areas you'll be walking around the island on a world map that will show you the available locations. Once you make a certain amount of story progress, however, you will have other means of travel opened up to you, such as the ability to sail between islands on your own via a ship, and towards the end of the game you'll unlock the ability to fly and freely travel between anywhere, which is especially helpful to clear the end-game content, as the game does feature an initial and then a true ending. After you beat the game for the first time, you can load the save back up and continue to track down available quests and side content to unlock the true ending. So that traversal comes into play quite a bit, which I tell you mostly because doing things like backtracking and going all the way back to previous areas you've explored that require you to trek halfway across an island is generally a waste of time, as you will find a much easier way to do that later. Nonetheless though, exploring the world is where I had a ton of fun. For starters, I think this is where the pixel art of course really shines, and it's been really cool to see what developers have done with pixel art over the years, such as with the HD 2D graphics from something like Octopath Traveler, or a game like this with just like fully animated pixel art, with things like a dynamic lighting system, etc., that just make exploring it feel really responsive and interactable in a way that you might not expect, while of course capturing a lot of that nostalgia of the classic games as well. So overall, I really enjoyed the look of this game, and you're going to be seeing a lot of it as you traverse a lot of the environment. Another surprising thing about the gameplay of this game is that there's a decent amount of what I would call platforming involved, where you're doing a lot of jumping around, moving around the scenery, and you can jump off and move and climb things fairly freely. Later on, you can even swim, etc., which makes for a world that feels like you can genuinely explore a little bit. A little later on, you even get the ability to change the time of day at will, which feeds into a lot of the environmental puzzles you're likely to mess around with, all of which just feels really cool to play with. That said, you can get up to a variety of activities out in the world as well. Probably about a third or so of the way through the game, you'll get the opportunity to build a town, and while it will start on its own, you can find plans and upgrades and things to make the town bigger and provide more services, and it can act as a sort of home base for you. While you're out and about in the world, either by finding a campfire or resting on the world map, you can enter the camp. Here you can talk to your companions and also engage in the cooking, which sees you picking up recipes and ingredients from the world as you travel through areas, and then turning them into meals, etc. You can also fish. So like I said, just a variety of activities and ways to interact with the world that are more substantial than you might first suspect. You can even go to an inn and participate in a game of wheels, which is a special mini game they've made for this game that is surprisingly enjoyable. I won't bore you with the rules, but as mini games go, I thought it was pretty neat. So when it comes to the world and gameplay, that's where I think this game shines the most. There's so much more to it than you might readily expect, and I think they did a good job of making it feel like an actual world. despite the game's relatively limited nature. Now that brings us to Steam Deck support before we wrap things up. I'll keep it pretty simple here, probably unsurprising given the type of game this is, but the game runs flawlessly on the Steam Deck, no issues at all. I played a substantial amount of this game on the Steam Deck. It has a verified rating, controller support, etc. It's a great way to play the game. Now on to our positives and negatives. Now, on the positive side of things, I really enjoyed the art style. The game just looks gorgeous. I really loved their approach to pixel art. I think the modern features, things like the customizable difficulty, were really cool to see, and it was honestly a blast to run around and explore. For our negatives, there were unfortunately a few major ones. For me, the main characters were just really boring. Again, the main characters of this game are hands down the most boring characters that get presented to you. They go through no growth or development, which is a weird contrast to the fact that like every other character you meet and interact with does have those things. So it just felt a little odd. And then the other thing is that combat does unfortunately just get stale over the course of this game. You've seen the bulk of it just a couple hours in, and it doesn't really get much better from there. But that, of course, brings us to our conclusion. You can pick up Sea of Stars for $35 full price on Steam and whatever that is regionally for you, though right now, through I believe the beginning of next week, it is actually on a small sale. And for that price, I think you're getting a very well done throwback turn-based RPG that, while certainly laced with nostalgia, also manages to be its own thing. And when it comes to capturing the essence of a lot of those older games, I think Sea of Stars really nails it, which makes it a very easy game to recommend. So naturally, it gets a buy from me. That, though, is going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know down below how you feel about Sea of Stars if you've checked it out for yourself yet. But truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.